Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. We are beginning now with a book. Probably strikes you as sort of an unusual thing to read, and I did that on purpose. But we're beginning with a book by Nadler and Nadler, by a father and son team. The father is a famous professor of 17th century philosophy, and his son is someone who is a fine artist, is an illustrator, and so they teamed up to bring the exciting story of philosophy in the 17th century to people beyond the father's existing group of philosophers who read him as a philosopher. So, you know how it normally goes. I talk about the book for a while, partway through, often at the end of a recording, I ask you a discussion question. That's sort of the standard format for our class. Well, this time, I'm going to try something new, try something unusual. I'm going to ask you the question straight up, right up front. What do you think about this book that you read by Nadler and Nadler? So, I'm changing up many things about my intro class, trying to make it more, just changing up all sorts of things. Teaching this book, this is the first time that I'm doing a recording on this book by Nadler and Nadler. So partly is I want to ask what you think about it, just to see what students think about it, because this will really be the first time I'm asking for this information. Second, I want to ask you about it because I want to sort of raise it as a question for you that, well, potentially philosophy could show up anywhere. There are movies with philosophical ideas in them. Movies like Memento and Inception and Dumb and Dumber. No, I'm just kidding. Not Dumb and Dumber. The Matrix, Scanner Darkly, all sorts of movies. In fact, some philosophers read every movie for the kind of philosophy they can see in it. But you can take a philosophy of film class and see how that works. So I'm going to ask you the question and say a tiny little bit about it. What do you think about this book? Does it seem, I don't know, maybe corny or childish to you because it's got illustrations in it? Or maybe you think instead that the pictures help clarify the information some, or at least keep it more interesting so you'll keep along with the information. Or maybe you think that the illustrations distract from the real point. There could be a whole variety of things you think. So in your own words, pause the recording now and write this down. What did you think about this reading by Nadler and Nadler in terms of being in a college philosophy course? Okay, please pause the recording and think about it now. Okay, you're back after pausing the recording and telling me what you think about this book. Okay. My reasons for teaching it are that before we get into Descartes, I want you to see some sort of context, the historical background for when Descartes was writing in the 17th century, and want you to understand how important philosophy was for the birth of modern science, how they used to be sort of helpmates. They used to reinforce each other, science and philosophy. And I want you to see that. So we get that nice context here in a way that, of course, Descartes isn't commenting on his historical moment in the same way that a book written hundreds of years later can point out what it was like then. So we can't really get that out of Descartes. I figured we'd get it out of this contemporary book. But that kind of contemporary history, you can get that in all sorts of textbooks. You don't need a graphic novel for that. But I thought, first of all, I think this is well written. I think it's accurate without getting bogged down into details. And I do feel that some of the scientific concepts, if you're only going to explain them in a word bubble or two, having a drawing next to it can really, really drive home quickly the point of the science issue just with a quick illustration. So I thought, here the graphic novel is actually an improvement over other ways of presenting this historical information. And I thought, too, I just wanted to show you philosophy still goes on in the contemporary world, and it takes many forms. Okay, there's books in philosophy written in all sorts of formats, graphic novels, funny books, all sorts of stuff. Just wanted to show you some of the variety of philosophy. Okay, so enough about why I chose this book. Let's talk about what goes on in Nadler and Nadler. Okay, so as the title says, full title of this book says, the dangerous and heretical ideas of early modern philosophy. In philosophy, when we say early modern, we often mean the 17th century. Your English professor is going to mean a different time period when she talks about early modern or modern. It varies depending on which major or school discipline you're talking about. Descartes, and when I say early modern in the next few minutes, just means 17th century for philosophy. Okay? So in 17th century or early modern philosophy, we see a number of sort of big questions that almost everyone comments on. And these are it's a different focus than you'll see in, say, ancient philosophy. It's a different focus than you'll see in a lot of, say, Eastern philosophy from China or India. And it's different than some of the emphasis that you'll see in contemporary today philosophy. So just so you know, some of the big questions kicking around in the 17th century that most philosophers gave their view on, and all different views, is the first big question is, what's the relationship of the individual to the state? Should the state be thought of as like a king? And there's still plenty of kings in the 17th century. Should government be instead a democracy, or what? So this question of who should be in charge of taxing, of deciding wars, etc. Should that be the people or the king, etc.? That's a big question. Another big question, typical of 17th century, is what's God's role in earthly life? Okay? Now, often today when people think about what God means for life, what they think of is moral or ethical claims. The 10 Commandments, basically. But you'll notice if you read the Bible, which not everyone actually really does, but if you read the Bible, there's so much in there that's not about just morality. So a big question in 17th century was, how does God relate to things like the rotation of the planets and stars around the earth? Does God set up the earth so that things will die, or does dying come somehow from life or animals themselves? So we want to know, in the 17th century, they're asking about, does God make water act like water, or does water do that itself? Is God intervening in the world? If there's a big thunderstorm in an unexpected time, is that a miracle from God, or does God rather let the world work all by itself without miracles? Those sort of questions about God's, how does God show up down here? Okay, that's a second big question. Third big question, or what we in philosophy call questions of free will. This is basically, how free are human beings actually when we feel like we make choices? Okay, it sure feels free when you do something, but the human body seems to be a physical body just like animals, and we don't really think that they make free choices. And in the early modern period, they're starting to figure out things like clocks and engineering and science really well for the first time. And they start realizing, wait a second, the world operates according to mechanical laws that are always the same. So they ask this question, maybe human beings operate according to mechanical laws that are always the same too. Maybe we're no more free than a rock rolling down a hill. So that's a third huge set of questions that early modern philosophy touches on. Now, Descartes, and our focus is really on this philosopher Descartes, this early modern philosopher. He touches on those things, but his main focus is this next big chunk of ideas. It's, how can we be sure what we think is true is actually true? How do we test an idea we have to see if it's true or not? And this is called epistemology. You don't really have to know the word, but you won't be tested on it or anything, but it's called epistemology, EPISTEMOLOGY. Epistemology. And it means like the science of science, the science of knowing, the discipline, or like a philosophy major of knowing how we know things. That's really what Descartes focuses on. Okay, he wants to know what method's going to produce regular truths. So instead of me thinking in ways that might be false or that others will disagree with, what might be a method or process that all of us can follow and we'll all get the same answer, right? If you and I do a chemistry experiment, we want the same method so that you and I can get the same answer or truth at the end of our experiment. And Descartes asking those same kind of questions about philosophy. There's always this question too of, how far will knowing things for certain go? Will it apply to math and physics only? Will it apply to math, physics, and philosophy? Or will it apply to math, physics, philosophy, and even things like morality? Could we have a science of morality where we all agree on the same exact answer? Those are the sort of questions that Descartes is wrestling with. Okay? And it really comes down to this question of technically epistemology comes down to this question. Who is the ultimate judge of truth? Is it God? Does God make and verify the truth? Is it your political ruler? Whatever the king or queen says goes? Is it instead the individual? Maybe it's not the individual, but the method that the individual follows out instead. Or maybe it's something like a university. Maybe those who are the experts are the ones who know, and they can teach others. And probably, right, it seems there's a grain of truth to all of these, right? But early moderns trying to figure out, okay, which one's really where truth resides? Which one's really the one that has or can sort of measure what's true and false? So today, and this is part of why it's valuable to study Descartes, today it probably seems obvious to you that the individual decides for herself or himself what's true or not. That probably seems like what a lot of you would go to as the main ultimate source or guide for what's true. But back in the early modern period and before it, it was definitely what God thought or what your community thought. That's where people thought truth resided. So Descartes is one of the first, and we will see why once we actually get to reading him. Descartes was one of the first to really push forward this idea that the individual, me, I decide, I'm the measure or guide to what's true. So you think that idea is obvious today, but for most of human history, in most human cultures, no one would have said that. No one would have said the individual helps create or decide what's true. Descartes is one of the first to say it, and so if you believe that, you really owe that idea to a 400-year-old history that sort of starts with him, that you are the lucky inheritor of it's your inheritance from people like Descartes. Okay. So that's sort of the context for this reading about the context. Let's get into the text itself, the reading itself. Okay. So in this, you saw the way this started out. It was really a battle with religion. But you have to understand this battle with religion in two ways. Okay? So this isn't philosophers against religion or religious people. Really, you want to think of the battle here that we see that seems to be against religion. It's not against religion. It's actually a battle between an institutionalized, sort of fossilized old power, the church, and the new rising power of philosophy and science. So don't think of being a heretic, like in the title here, as being anti-religious. It's just one new group of people trying to seize power and put it in universities and in books. And they're wrestling over power with those who put power in the institution of the church and one single book, the Bible. So another way you can think of this, again, it's neither way is anti-religious, but that what we see here is a battle between an older way of knowing and a newer way of knowing. So this older way of knowing, authorized by the church, comes in the Bible, the Old and the New Testament. Okay. Now, what the what the church used to speak and write in was Latin. It's now a dead language, but it was still pretty big in the 17th century. So the church used Latin, which most people did not read, write, or speak, to talk about religion. It's a dead language now, right? And they would talk about books that were originally written in ancient Hebrew, which no one speaks, writes, or reads today, or then, and the New Testament, which they only had in a Greek translation, which is again a dead language, which no one spoke, wrote, or read in at the time. Almost no one. Okay, so that's the old way of knowing. One language, Latin, which only a bunch of fat old rich scholars knew, about books written in ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek, which were dead languages, which even fewer people knew. Okay? Now, that old way of knowing was battling against this newer way of knowing, which was written sometimes in Latin, but sometimes in French or Spanish or English. And that meant, since it was written in a language which people actually spoke, wrote, and read in, that everyone could come to this new way of knowing. Instead of it being something for the elites, like I said, fat old guys with white hair who knew these dead languages, this new way of knowledge is something that anyone who can speak any language or write any language might be able to have access to. So that's the battle. I don't want you to think that philosophy is anti-religious, or that it's anti-science or anti-anything else. The real battle here isn't against God or against religion. It's against an old form of power and an old form of knowing, and then the new form of power and knowing, which is philosophy and science. Okay. And you can see that explanation of what heretics means on the second written page of the reading, which is the fourth page in terms of the PDF file itself. You can see that explanation of what heretics means. Okay. So let's go on. The first character, and these are all real people. This is all absolutely real people, is Bruno. Okay, Bruno was burnt at the stake for his ideas. Remember, Socrates dies for his ideas. Lots of times, people with new ideas are punished for them. So Bruno was punished, burnt at the stake. Now, literally, one of the ideas for which he was punished was his idea that the Earth is not the center of our galaxy, but rather that the sun was at the center of it. So he died for a true belief. He died partly because he knew the truth, which is that the Earth is not the center of our galaxy or universe. They literally killed him because he knew the truth. Okay? This is part of why it's always so dangerous to ban or not allow people to talk about what seems like an obviously false idea. Because we all, 99% of us, might be wrong that it's a false idea. So think about it this way. I know you all know that the Earth is not the center of our universe, that the Earth spins around the sun. That's obvious to you now. But bracket out what you know for a second. Think about what it's like for every human being. When you walk outside, what do you see? You do not see the Earth spinning. You don't feel it moving under your feet. And you do see the sun appearing to move in the sky. Like I said, who would ever challenge such an idea? It seems so obvious. What's the point of even talking about it or disputing it? That obviously the sun moves through the sky over us. Obviously the sun is different from everything else in the universe. The Earth is different from everything else in the universe, and the stars are a third different kind of thing. Okay, only a philosopher, only someone who loves knowledge and takes nothing for granted, wants to question every idea, is going to even think that maybe the Earth is spinning on its axis and then spinning around the sun, and that those things themselves are in motion relative to other things. So only because Bruno had a philosophical mind and challenged everything did he discover the real truth. Everyone else was certain that the lie, the falsity, was true. And sometimes people die for calling out the truth like that. Okay, so I say this partly because one basic rejection of Descartes but also philosophy generally, is I already know what's true. Certain things are totally obvious to me, and you're silly for even doubting the obviousness of my everyday practical experience. Well, your everyday practical experience shows you that the sun moves around the earth, which is false. And it literally took scientists and philosophers to show that true idea. It wasn't your gut or your intuitive experience that showed you that. Philosophy and science showed us that. Okay. So they burned Bruno at the stake, and it takes about 15 years for someone else to be brave enough to publicly discuss and publish on this again. That's Copernicus. You may have heard of him. Since his ideas are more well known than Bruno, we call it the, quote, Copernican revolution. This idea that the universe is what's called, or sorry, the galaxy is what's called heliocentric. It's centered around the sun rather than around the earth. Okay, well, Copernicus caught some of the same kind of heat, right? His ideas were banned. Then it took another 15 years or so for someone to be brave enough to publish ideas like this again. And his name's Galileo. You've probably heard of him as well. So Galileo was brave enough to say, no, sorry church, sorry people who, kings and everyone who's in charge. I'm pretty sure the sun is the center of our galaxy rather than the earth. He also challenged the obvious idea. This is, again, what our intuition would tell us. Our intuition and our personal experience tells us that heavier objects fall faster than light objects. But that's false, right? That's false. You drop a 5-pound weight and a 25-pound weight from the same height, they will land at the same time. And it's people like Galileo who figure out these very non-obvious but very important scientific truths. Now you might be thinking, yeah, Chris, philosopher Chris, scientists figured this out. Philosophers don't figure out any of this stuff. One point I want to make here is that all of these people, Bruno, Copernicus, Galileo, and Descartes, our buddy Descartes, who we're going to talk about more in a moment, they all would have considered themselves philosophers. Some of them would have just said, full stop, I'm a philosopher, that's it. And some of them might have said, I'm a philosopher, but I'm also an experimental scientist. Or they might have said, I study grammar, but I'm also a philosopher. But all of them would have taken themselves to be philosophers. Partly it's because science has not yet been separated off as a specific way of knowing. Science doesn't really exist as we understand it before about the 17th century, give or take. So when they did science, they said, well, I'm pursuing knowledge or wisdom through science. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Boom. I'm doing philosophy when I do science. I'm doing science when I do philosophy. Okay? Literally, our word science comes from the Latin word scientia, which is Scientia, and that used to just mean knowledge. It was a specific way of knowing. So, literally, historically, science and philosophy were, at this time, sort of fused together still. And also at a sort of grammar or word level, science means a way of knowing, philosophy means a love of wisdom or a way of knowing. They're different, but they're not opposites, right? So I just want to say that for those of you who think, oh, no, philosophy's dead and old and dumb, it doesn't produce truth, only science produces truth. Well, the two are actually closer than they might seem. Okay, so part of the struggle of early modern philosophy in general and science in general against the established forms of knowing and the established forms of power are that people would try to use religion to talk about things that religion isn't really designed for. So they try to use the Bible to prove certain scientific principles. But the Bible's not really trying to talk about science. It's not really trying to talk about weather, like meteorology. It's not really trying to talk about chemistry, etc. So what you would get is people picking out sort of random bits of the Bible, often in a language that they did not, written in a language originally that they did not fully understand, and then taking a few scraps of words and then trying to predict the weather with it. So that's what they were fighting against. Not fighting against religion, but this abuse of power where you would take something that had authority, the Bible, and try to use it to have authority over everything, including science. So part of what early modern science and philosophy had to do was convince people that as much as they all loved the Bible, and almost all of them did, okay, they had to convince people that maybe the Bible is good for some things, but not all things. The Bible is not going to tell you how to produce titanium oxide. We need different rules that will help us govern new subjects. Okay? So, moving on. We see it basically the same thing happens again and again with different names in this book we're reading by Nadler and Nadler in 17th century philosophy. And again, this is totally historically accurate. It's exactly what happened. There was this constant tension between telling the truth and getting in trouble. If you brought up new ideas, you were instantly in trouble with those who had the old, powerful ideas. So partly we're reading this to show you that philosophy, it's not just Socrates or one or two people. It's consistent throughout the history of philosophy that philosophy can be almost defined as bravely telling the truth. Okay? Bravely admitting your ignorance about what you don't know. I don't know how to make titanium oxide. And then using that as a starting point to get more and more knowledge, more and more truth, and then share that with others. And like I said, when those who have bad, outdated, old knowledge are told new truths, you have to be pretty brave as a philosopher or a scientist to bring these new truths to other people. So, of course, right, I as a philosopher want to push this definition that philosophers are the ones who bravely tell the truth, even if it's going to get them into trouble. Right? But I bet a lot of you think that personally that you're the same kind of person, that you're willing to risk your neck in order to tell the truth, right? So the thing is, you and I both probably take some pride in ourselves that we're willing to tell the truth even if it's not popular, right? But what I would like to say is what many historical figures have done before is way above what you and I might do. Way above what you and I might do. And I include myself here. I'm not talking down to you. I'm not accusing you of anything except for what I'm accusing my own self of as well. These people are braver than our existing bravery, basically. Because think about it. They were telling truths to authority figures who didn't like these truths. Yeah, I don't really rattle anybody in authority. They were threatened with house arrest, with death, with the confiscation of their books, the banning of their books. No one really threatens me as a college professor. I can say lots of nonsense and no one's going to take away my books or throw me in jail, right? Also, I want to say, even the ideas I come up with, and probably the ideas that you bravely speak as well, are they really disruptive? So when you think of disruption in the way that Silicon Valley always talks about that, how apps and new technology can be disruptive, I don't really know if I'm upsetting the apple cart with most of my ideas. I'd love to, but most of them aren't that radical. And probably same thing for you when you bravely speak truth even though people don't like it. It's not necessarily some revolutionary disruption that you're about to unleash, but it's something else. So, something I'd also like to say is often when we bravely speak truth, we speak, quote, our own truths. We speak something personal. Well, here's how I feel. But what these philosophers were doing is they weren't just saying how they felt. They were saying ideas that might be true for other people too. They were saying things about like the earth we all live on in fact rotates this way. The chemicals we all use in our pipes, like lead, are poisoning us. Not just personal things that they felt like and wanted to share as personal truths, but ideas that could be of value to anyone. So once more, I'd say these philosophers, even more than me as a philosopher, and definitely more than most people are able to do, they give true ideas and not personal opinions. They live dangerously. So they they prefer truth to their own personal comfort or safety. And they try to share truths that are general and useful to other people, not just talking about themselves. So that's really raising the bar really high, right? Their brave telling of the truth, it goes way above what you, I, and most people do. Now, that's not a way of saying we're bad and we're not as good as them. No. It's just saying there are some lives out there that really take this love of wisdom to a really high level. And part of why I'm teaching this book is we see a variety of them in just a few pages. And that's sort of, it's a high bar, but it's maybe one we can all aspire to live closer to. Use it as an idea to sort of boost up our behavior. Okay. So, we see some sort of saltiness here. There's a quote attributed to Galileo that even when the Inquisition put him in house arrest, that he came out of his house and stamped his foot on the ground and said in Italian, "But it moves." And yet the earth moves. So his point was, they can try to make him lie about what he knows. They can burn his books. They can personally not believe what he says. But all of that action and commotion doesn't affect the truth. It doesn't affect the facts of this earth that we all share. We can have different opinions, and we can read some books and burn others if we want. But the earth still is the same earth. And we all live on that earth together. And by gum, if it moves, then it moves, and all of us move with it. So the truth can be a global phenomenon. It doesn't rest on the temporary power of somebody in the Inquisition. It doesn't rest even with Galileo, but it's about the real stuff that we all share in common, the world itself. Okay. So you notice here that there's an ancient philosopher who Descartes and others are against. This ancient philosopher's name is Aristotle, and details aside, he's a student of Plato, and Plato was a student of Socrates. So he's a couple generations out from Socrates. So Aristotle was used to explain everything in Western Europe for about 2,000 years. He was used to explain physics and morality and politics. He was used to explain the Bible even. So he was from the 3rd or 4th century BC up to the 17th century. For almost 2,000 years straight, the only theory that was used to explain things in Western Europe was a philosopher. They didn't have science yet, so they used philosophy. So far from philosophy being useless, it was the only thing used in Western Europe to justify religion, ethics, politics, and the sort of early proto-science they had going. Engineers would read Aristotle to figure out how physics worked, and other ancient philosophers. And in fact, when Europe lost Aristotle's books, so few people could read and write that books were super rare. There was a period in Europe where no one knew where books by Plato and Aristotle were. And you know about what time in Europe that was, when they didn't have philosophy and could not use philosophy? It was the Dark Ages. It wasn't until the 1200s that they rediscover, it's actually the Jewish and Arabic world had copies of these books. And when there was contact between Western Europe and Jewish and Arabic scholars, the Western Europe got access again to its sort of history and these philosophy books that it used to use, and rediscovered. I'm playing a little fast with the history here, but that's basically when the Dark Ages end, is when Western Europe rediscovers philosophy. When they rediscover Plato and Aristotle, they start building more universities, and pretty soon after that, science develops. So it's a complicated story, but I just want to float this. I'm trying to challenge a common idea that many of my students have. They say science and technology today are the truth. Science and technology are the opposite of philosophy. Therefore, philosophy can't give the truth and never has. And what I want to say is philosophy did give the truth for a long time. was used for very practical things like politics and science, and that what is today modern science is only an offshoot or variety or offspring of philosophy. So they're not quite as different as they would seem. Okay. Especially what we're going to see with Descartes is his method in the Meditations, which we will read, is almost exactly that of science. He says, I know I'm wrong, but I don't know how to fix it. What if I could develop a method that I could do and then you could replicate, and that both of us following the same method are going to reach the same conclusions or answers, and we can be certain about those answers instead of pretty sure. It's almost exactly the method of science. And so that's surprising to most people. So I'm just going to make one last point here, and then we will stop this recording, because then I want to start talking about Descartes. And you noticed in the reading, it's around page 25, that it starts really focusing on Descartes. Well, half that information is relevant for the Meditations, which we're going to start reading next. So the next recording is going to be sort of a mix of themes from Nadler and Nadler, but since they're themes about Descartes, the next recording will be a blend of what Descartes is going to say and what Nadler and Nadler say about Descartes. But focusing here on the sort of history that we're reading for Nadler, the history that's not in Descartes, just want to make a final point. So the church, remember what the church was doing. It wasn't persecuting people only because they had bad religious ideas. It was persecuting people because the church didn't like the physics that they were putting forward. That should strike you as sort of weird. How does religious salvation really hinge on whether the sun or the earth is the center of the universe? Okay, and remember, that's the focus here, and really that's a big part of early science, is the church coming after scientists for scientific views, not for strictly moral or religious views. That should seem weird to you, but it's not that weird. The church was absolutely right about this, and it's something I've pointed out about philosophy and knowledge in general, is that all of our ideas, if they're good ideas, are connected to and supported by other ideas, right? So there's often some connection between what you think about science and what you think about human life, say in ethics. And there's often something between what you think about morality and something you think about religion. So the church was right that certain ideas imply other ideas, and that ideas even about, say, physics can connect to your religious ideas. So they're not wrong in being worried that certain ideas about physics might imply different religious ideas than they were trying to give people at the time. Okay? And part of why I point this out is that philosophy itself tries to get you to ask these hard questions. If your ideas of politics are one thing, but your ideas about sociology and psychology, for instance, are the opposite, how can you have two ideas in your head, one about politics, one about sociology, that say opposite things? How can you believe that something is and isn't a certain way at the same time? Same thing, if you've got a biology idea that says one thing, but a sociology idea that says the opposite, you sort of can't really believe both at the same time. You can't believe that the answer adds up to 2 and that it adds up to 7 for the same math question, right? So, this is what science, philosophy, and religion were struggling with in the early modern 17th century. Which ideas cancel each other out? And which ideas mutually support each other? If I learn new knowledge, what other ideas may I have to revise? And which ideas do I get to expand with additional knowledge? Okay? So that's what this reading and what our class in general is calling for you to do. Think about your ideas in enough depth that you can see which ones connect to each other, which is good, They get like triple more powerful when you combine two ideas. And see which of your ideas can't be combined because they say opposite things. If you believe two ideas that seem to say opposite things, probably one of them is false and you want to get rid of it. Okay, so I'll end on that note, a sort of summary of what philosophy is and how it's good at helping you combine ideas to get more power out of them, and helping you sort out which of your ideas conflict and therefore stand in some need of revision. Okay, we're going to end this recording here. Thank you, everyone.